Welcome to Season 5 of the Agile Brand with Greg Kihlstrom, where we talk with enterprise and technology platform leaders about the people, processes, and platforms that make marketing and customer experience successful, scalable, and sustainable. This is what creates an Agile brand. I'm your host, Greg Kihlstrom, advisor and consultant for Fortune 1000 marketing and CX leaders and teams as principal and chief strategist at GK5A, and best-selling author, keynote speaker, entrepreneur, and Agile certified coach. The Agile Brand podcast is brought to you by TEKsystems, an industry leader in full-stack technology services, talent services, and real-world application. For more information, go to teksystems.com. To sign up for the Agile Brand newsletter and get the latest insights and articles on marketing technology and CX, or to purchase a copy of my latest book, House of the Customer, go to gregkihlstrom.com. You can also find all my books on Amazon and other retailers. And now on to the show. Today we're going to talk about headless e-commerce and how it provides some innovative and beneficial opportunities for retail providers and their customers. To help me discuss this topic, I'd like to welcome Chris Bach, co-founder, CCO, and CSO at Netlify, a company that powers web experiences for major retailers like Victoria Beckham Beauty, Valentine and Butcher Box. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, looking forward to talking about this with you. Why don't we get started with you giving a little background on yourself as well as what you're currently doing at Netlify?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I'm Chris Bach. I'm originally from Copenhagen, Denmark. So is my co-founder, Matt. And we came to the Bay Area about 8 years ago to create Netlify. We saw an opportunity to change the architecture, the underlying architecture of how site stores and apps are built. And we wanted to create a workflow platform for that to sort of further that movement along. And that really paved the path towards the headless and composable architectures that we see today.
Great. So let's, we're going to explore headless e-commerce and some of the opportunities it provides for retail providers. Get started though with, if you could provide just a little definition for those a little bit less familiar with, what is headless e-commerce, and what are some of the main reasons that retailers are moving towards headless e-commerce?
Yeah, absolutely. I think to start with, let's talk about what it isn't, right? What we came from. And so we came from a web where we essentially had very large pieces of software, we call them monoliths, that would run somewhere on a server. And it would sort of try to contain everything you needed, right? So it had your business logic, it had your data. So if you had requirements for a marketing coordinator that needed to be able to update certain things and write new content, then the software that did that would also necessarily dictate everything else, right? Like the template engine, the build tool, but the whole UI, the whole actual website and everything else would be part of that software and powered from the same thing. And that came out, and it was great in the beginning. It really sort of birthed social internet and what we called Web 2.0 back then. But this notion that the web was a very interactive site because you could build a new version for every single visitor, and that was beautiful. But then we started growing. We got more and more digital touch points. I mean, today we're even in a place where most business problems have digital solutions. So these large monoliths, they sort of just became best in class at nothing, right? And they were very huge, clunky. You could call it somewhat bloated, but very often what it leads to is what's the nightmare of every marketer is probably a very slow time to market, right? That anything you do requires a bunch of backstage operations. You hand over tickets and hope that someone gets back to you in a few months and makes even small changes and edits in your store size and apps. And so this headless architecture was born out of a notion of decoupling everything, right? So what it means is, if we talk of the sites itself, and that's what Netlify sort of came in and facilitated, is the notion that whatever app you have, whatever site, whatever store, whoever's using this, whether it's a mobile banking app or it's a web app, or if it's an e-commerce site or marketing campaign site, what you're seeing there, and it's the technology that's used to build it, what we call the front end, is separated from the back end. And so you can go out in that way of saying, okay, well, then I can get what's called a headless API. I can get a piece of software that's really, really optimized for the transactional layer. And I can get a piece of software that's very, very good for my content management. And I can get a piece of software that lives as an headless API that does commenting and different things, right? And then you can build out the digital properties independent of it. And that frees up a ton of things. And we'll get into that, right? But in basically, that means that you can, for example, have the same content management system, and now you can build a mobile application that draws from it and a website that draws from it. And because it stands as what we call a headless API, it can be accessed from many different places. And it's no longer responsible for building those things out. So now in every case, you can change to whatever technology you want, and you can use best practice. Now, what all that translates into is that you're going from a compromised monolith to best-in-class components. You only use what you need, and you can now, and this is probably for companies at large, the very biggest advantage, you can have interchangeability. Okay. So typically you might spend as much as 7 years or something, right? Building out these large monoliths, and you have them and you feel like there's so much cost sunk into it, and it's took so long that the notion of changing it's going to take forever. So even though you would love to have a different module as part of it, or you would want to change your analytics or whatever it might be, well, unfortunately, you can't do that without changing everything. Yeah. And that's obviously a huge blocker. And commerce has moved digital to a greater extent. It's only a number that will keep on growing. And so we really can't afford to be that slow to market anymore. It's not just like getting a small competitive edge. It's just fundamental to the business to be able to have efficient properties and make changes fast. And that's really what Headless promises, because now that API is separated out. I can take that and I can bring in a new commerce engine or whatever it might be without having to change everything else. Yeah. So that's the basic core of this, right? It's a decouplement that allows us to use best-in-class components.
Yeah. So yeah, I love the line best in class at nothing. So for those monolith platforms, because it's true. It's like they certainly had their place and were foundational for what we're doing right now. But
absolutely,
certainly, so and it's being able to actually use the best in class components certainly allows retailers to do some amazing things. Maybe could you provide what does that look like for the marketers out there that are obviously there's a lot of competition out there. There's high customer expectations. What are some examples maybe of how Headless can be used in a meaningful way?
You're absolutely right. There's high expectations, and that's a challenge, right? We dropped from American Customer Satisfaction Index. We dropped in overall customer satisfaction of e-commerce from and this was done with more than 400 companies across industries in a scale from 0 to 100, from 77 in 2018 to 73 in 2022, which is actually the largest decline in the index 28-year history, right? I mean, it shows is that consumers are becoming much more demanding.
Yeah.
And demanding. And so they need immediacy, for example, with load times, right? And you need everything from good return options to having a very easy time to navigate your site, finding the help you need, and so on. So there is most definitely not just a lot of competition, but very high expectations to your users. Now, if we talk about the main reasons for composability, and maybe just preface that with just how fast this is growing, right? So back in 2020, Gartner was out saying that 12% of enterprises, if they were building out a new digital experience platform, or you could say sort of prime marketing software stack, they would do so composably with this best in class, right? But again, with a lifetime to 7 to 10 years, that translates into very few percent actually doing it that year. In January 2023, they were saying that 70% of all enterprises will be building with this architecture this year. Wow. So it's absolutely exploding. Yeah. So again, back to why is that happening? And there's a number of reasons for that. And so without going into too much details, let's start with a top one: faster time to market. So for Netlify, for example, and just to explain what Netlify does is that when you use best-in-class components, there's no single component that runs everything. So now it's up to you or whoever's building the site for you or the store or the app or building out these digital properties to tie it all together. Now, there's a lot of overhead in that. And Netlify was the first platform sort of created to automate all of that for you. So you essentially have a platform that takes and abstracts away all the traditional operations around hosting, that gives you a singular developer workflow where everything plugs in and allows you now with our latest layer also to plug in all your content sources and everything else into a singular workflow. And so that becomes important simply because now you have a viable way of going about it, right? You go get the right components, and then how they talk to each other and how it actually runs as coherent sites at the end of it is something that we can then help automate. But in that faster time to market, just as an example, on our enterprise clients, they typically push to production on average across the board, and this is more than 800 companies, once per week before they join Netlify. Afterwards, we have an average of 28 times to production a day.
Wow.
And so what that means is that your A/B tests, your experimentations, the smaller updates have become much, because they're so frequent, they become much faster. And that's because you can use that platform, right? You don't have to have these huge monoliths where everything is interconnected. These services are standalone. So if you're changing something in your front end, you just do that. That means that your marketing developer doesn't have to go and tap DevOps or IT operations or whoever it might be on the shoulder to say, can you please upgrade the rules on our global edge networks and all these other things, so I have a chance to get this live. But they can simply just go in, and with a single click, everything is automatically run, optimized, distributed, and built, and you're live. That's it, right? Yeah. And so something like that is very helpful. Now, of course, that's a Netlify specific example in the orchestration of headless and composable, but also the notion of having these headless architectures by themselves, right? Because everything is accessible as an API, and you're dividing out the sort of the responsibilities. You're not changing anything in an API that doesn't need to be changed. Things move much faster. So a faster time to market is really essential. Yeah. The next one I would say is speed. Speed is something that everyone understands, and especially within e-commerce, because your final conversion actually happens right there as part of that immediate digital journey, right? It turns into cash, right? In basket and checked out. And so what we mean by speed here is faster load times. Now, when you are using composable and headless architecture, that also means that your front end is separated. That means that you can pre-generate a lot of this front end. So the shell of the site in itself is actually built up front. It doesn't have to be built for every visitor. Now, that means that you are spending a lot less time running code because it's already run up front, but it also means you can distribute it. So instead of saying, oh, our server is in San Francisco, so it'll take a little longer if you're connecting from Tokyo, you can say our site or store or app is equally distributed all over the world. It's just as much in Sydney as it is in Frankfurt. So it's always right next door. And what it translates is what we call a very, very fast time to first byte. That means that the user will get communication received immediately. And surveys really show just how much that means. We are very impatient, but if you feel something is coming, right, that very much helps to lower bounce rate. And a lower bounce rate means higher conversion. And don't just take my word for it. I mean, look at the studies from Deloitte, from Amazon, from Google, from Yahoo, that all show the value of 100 milliseconds. I think Deloitte's latest one showed that 8% increase in conversion is what you got from every 100th milliseconds. That's a tenth of a second, right? So that faster load time means the world. Right. Yeah. So speed is really of the essence, and it's much, much more attainable by this architecture. Now, a second part of this is that traditionally you do a lot to optimize monolithic sites, right? And so you have what we call caching layers, and there's operational people that have to sit and tweak that. That's part of what gives a slow time to market, because there's more people that have to touch every release. But it is also a very manual process. Now, what we have, for example, at Netlify supplies, that all is automated. There is no overhead on it. There's no people touching it. It's not because it's a managed service by us. It's the architecture itself allows you to have near perfect cache validation, which is a technical term for saying it's fast by default. Yeah. So if you have a marketing intern publishing something in the corner, it's just as fast as a highly optimized sites that you spent hundreds of thousands of dollars and big teams on having to optimize if it had been a monolithic site, right? So what composable and headless architecture is done right opens the door for is that you can get not just faster, but faster by default.
Before we continue, let's take a quick break. If you're like many marketing leaders today, you're inundated with a need to improve the customer experience across an increasing number of channels and touch points, all while ensuring your team is performing well, innovating, and continuously improving. So how do you find the time to determine what's next for you, your team, your brand, and your customers? My company, GK5A, can help. Whether it is advisory services, evaluation of marketing technology platforms and solutions, or digital agencies and implementation partners, or assistance with creating strategic roadmaps and prioritization of efforts, we've done it all and served as an ally to Fortune 1000 brands in industries like financial services, healthcare, consumer electronics, professional services, and more. You can learn more about these services and contact us at www.gk5a. That's www.gk5a.com. Now let's get back to the show. I think also I want to talk a little bit more about the end customers in a second here and the benefits for them. You already touched on a few things as far as speed and things, but just to kind of talk, a number of these things you're talking about are, it's really like reducing friction for change and for improvement and for experimentation and stuff. And so some of it may go without saying as far as what that means for the the marketer, the customer facing person within an org. But, when time is not spent either waiting for engineering to roll out a new change or, whatever the case, but when time isn't being spent waiting or with complexity or testing or all of those things, like what does that also enable, some of these people to be able to do with their, strategically and everything as well?
Well, I think if there's a lot of doors that are opened here, right? And we just talked of two advantages. There's also those of scalability. It's much, much easier to cater omnichannel, which is becoming extremely important because you can build specifically for each of those digital touch points, and it's not dictated by the backend logic, right? So you can do best-in-class experiences on each one of those, which is also becoming crucial, I would say, right? Because omnichannel is, go to Macy's or Target, and they'll tell you that they get four to 5 times as much large basket size for customers that use more than one single channel, like as an in-store, for example, right? Omnichannel is just really, really important. But and the list goes on. Like there's also very, very large flexibility. And I think that's one of the things that really counts for marketers as well, right? Is because in that old world, you're sort of locked in. Right. I have a system administrator somewhere, maybe at a big consultancy, making business critical decisions for me. And I'm a CMO. I'm not, right? But if I am, that's decisions that should belong to me. Right.
Right.
You have big marketing campaigns that have to drive on separate domains because it's just too hard and painful and too slow to integrate them on the actual properties you have. Now, that means you have to go and buy all the traffic because there's not a lot of natural SEO for it, right? Which is also painful.
Yeah.
There's a lot to be had here, but if with that flexibility, right, it also comes into, for example, now I can build something. I have developers that are proficient in this type of programming. Well, great, since it's independent from the existing solution, I can choose what this part can be built in, and that makes it much easier to go and find people that can do the work for you. It also gives you a much easier chance for brand differentiation. And I think this is really important. And it goes back to the first thing you said. It's a very competitive market, right? And if every store looks like Amazon store, it's very, very hard to stand out, right? And so what headless means, contrary to a monolith, is that you give complete freedom. Now, what it means, again, is that let's say you have a designer and design a layout that you'd like. It's turned into HTML by front-end designer, and then it's shipped off for someone to implement into a back-end system. Well, you get it back. It didn't really look like what you sent to them. And they're like, well, it doesn't really fit into the templates. It has to sort of fit into what this backend can support.
Yeah.
But now it's decoupled. So now that store experience, the checkout flow, everything that you want, you have different sign-up options along the way. You might want to break something up, or you want to experiment in having, I want to see if there's a little less I have to fit in per screen, but I have 5 steps instead of 4. The experiments there, they are in your power, right? You can do that as a marketing department. If you have a normal developer just sitting there, they can do that without having to involve everyone else. Now that's a superpower, right? Because that means that now you can build a complete differentiated brand experience. And that becomes very, very important. Yeah. Another thing that I see here is the faster time to market, what it translates into. I always find it so interesting because you cannot find a person dealing with e-commerce or any digital properties that won't tell you that A/B testing is best practice. But if you look at the amount of including large enterprise main .coms out there where this isn't, there's not done a lot of experimentations or A/B testing. More, there's just new releases of campaigns and so on being planned and scheduled and executed. Yeah. It's pretty crazy, and it's because it's extra work, right? And if you have to tweak something, the color of your call to action buttons or whatever it might be, and then you have to wait 4 years, or not 4 years, well, that would be terrible, right?
Hopefully not.
But let's say like several weeks to get that actually released and see the results of it, you're not going to bother, right? But if you can immediately do it and immediately attract the results, what we see is that things like experimentation and A/B testing becomes best practices for many more of for the clients that we get to work with, for example, right? And so that changes the whole narrative for the market and what they're able to do with these kinds of digital properties. Yeah. And now the last thing is, of course, you might not just have an e-commerce site. You might have one of marketing sites. You have developer documentations. We work with fitness companies that have applications running on the actual fitness, bikes or instruments where they are streaming video and so on. But in the old world, the business logic behind it would be vastly different. So, and since they dictated how that UI in the front end was built, they were completely siloed. Now they're reusing libraries and components and so on. For the marketer, that also means that you have access to platforms you didn't before, but also that it can bring a different kind of uniformity, that design systems have much easier time being applied across things where they normally just share a PDF at best, right? And so, and that list goes on, but it has a lot of real world implications for marketers and commerce leaders to be able to embrace this technology, but also do it in the right way.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, a lot of what you touched on from the marketer's perspective, obviously the customer's gonna be able to benefit from that. And, the customers out there, they're not able to see that there's a headless versus a monolithic platform that's behind their e-commerce, but they certainly feel it, right? They know to your point, they're omni-channel, they're moving around. They want personalized experiences. They want fast experiences. A lot of these things that you touched on already. But maybe just at a high level, it's like how do customers really benefit from this approach and in new and meaningful ways?
Well, for the customers, of course, what it means is that they get a better user experience, right? Yeah. For more than one reason. One is, of course, speed. And that is incredibly important. I once heard a survey that said that 4% of all people have thrown their mobile phone in disgust because it took too long to load something.
Wow. I hope they had a good case, but yeah.
Exactly, right? But an immediate experience is so important. I was working with some high-end luxury fashion brands, and we were talking about all the things they're able to do in store. Right. And when it comes to an online experience, let's face it, it is more graphics and on a screen. Right. And so the personal attention and the textures, the smells, the lighting, the material, the ads that you put around the store, the way to navigate the customer journey through different products and so on is very different in store. Right. But what we talked about is that how do you translate the luxury feeling mostly And they had traditionally been working with very large images and so on. However, it took forever to load, right? Because especially a few years ago in the mobile connections, that would be, you have the front page of Vogue being 150 megabyte, right? That's just going to take forever.
Right.
But it was actually, immediacy, that idea of it popping up, being right there, that pervades that sensation of quality to a very high extent. And I thought that was very interesting, right? And so being able to cater your customer in a speedy manner, and often, especially at checkout, like I'm sure we've all tried that, the sort of, did this expensive plane ticket, did it go through or not?
Right.
I just feel nothing is happening. Should I click again? Should I not click? Will I buy twice if I click again? Right. Like, actually having something that works fast means a lot to the customer. And the ones that say, I don't mind if I wait a second or more. Of course, no one would. However, the data is the data is the data. An extra second means a much higher bounce rate, right? So I think that's how it translates. The other thing is, of course, the offerings, right? So that digital experience might very well be hampered by being tied into a monolith where they have to get off, or they think they have to get off all of it at once.
Yeah.
And so they stick to a monolith that just gives a worse experience, right? They might not to be able to do the design updates to do, or work with the kind of animations or whatever it is else it is, right? Or be able to configure the site in where the calendar goes and everything else in a way that would be better for the customer journey. It might be harder to do logged-in sections and where it's more personalized for a repeat user, or whatever it might be, right? When you do composable, you can add these newer elements at a faster pace because you don't have to change everything else. And that interchangeability will heighten the digital experience. And that benefits the customer as well. So I think it benefits the customer in more ways than one. Then, of course, there's just there's a security aspect as well, right? So if we're now not talking huge corporate sites, but smaller sites, very often if they build on a legacy platform, the fact that it's building for every visitor, the fact that your site actually does that, and many people listening to here that haven't embraced Headless, that's what's happening to your site for every visitor. There's a build and it's public, right? And you do something to secure it, but the reality is it has to build all the time. As soon as code is executed, it's infectable. So the notion of trying to build that website up front, right, on a developer's laptop, and then having it distributed out there as something that's more ready-made, that also is much more what we call secure by default. So that we go by securable to secure by design to secure by default. If there's nothing to infect, that helps. And in the real world and pragmatic, because I know if any CISO would talk about saying, well, there's a million other ways that things can be insecure. But in reality, the vast majority of malware out there is targeted these very popular large surface areas, monoliths that have to do everything and that has exposed running code. Yeah. And by taking that out of the equation, that makes it more secure. Now, that's great for the company, but it's obviously also great for the individual visitor, that there's a less chance that they're exposed with something that wants to install a script that mines Bitcoin whenever their laptop is idle, right? And so, like, I think there's numerous ways that the end client is benefited by this.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, Chris, thanks so much for joining today. It was great talking with you. I've got one last question before we wrap up here. For those enterprise e-commerce teams, marketing folks listening out there, maybe they are still on a monolithic platform and not quite moved off yet. What's a first step that they can take towards taking these approaches?
Absolutely. That's the best question, right? Because I don't want this to sound like it's without challenges, right? It's not there's no silver bullets here. Moving to a headless and composable architecture and moving from being so dependent on large operations and taking those operations that you had in your cloud and more automating that, turning it into code, enabling the individual developers, it takes time. And it's not done overnight, right? It can be a multi-year process. However, the beautiful promise, the most important thing, and the thing you really have to understand is that you come from a world where you had one big system. And if you wanted a new one, you build out the system. It'll take years. You port all the content, all the rules and everything. That takes years almost, right? And then you feature log and 18 months later, you're live. That is not the case here. You can do things gradually. We talk about gradual migrations. And so yes, it takes years to transform your entire business to using headless composable architecture, but you can also do this step by step. and you get immediate value. So the difference is, before you had to do all of it before getting any value whatsoever, after having sunk an incredible amount of money in it. Now you can start with a corner and you can see value immediately, and that's what Netlify is specializing in. So the industry body for this category is called MACH, M-A-C-H, Alliance, and there's we're about 100 members. Netlify is in it, so is AWS, Google, and a bunch of others as well, and so. I sit on the executive board and have had a very close view, both in almost a decade in Netlify and in the Market Alliance, to seeing what are the challenges and what are the best ways to get started. And so at Netlify, for example, we now focus very much on saying it's not either or. In many cases, you won't have a singular stack. So you might have some things that you keep running on a monolith, and then you have something that will go headless. And so we build out a platform that caters just that can come in, start by saying, on that legacy platform, what can we do? How can we make that headless, for example, which means that you don't get necessarily much faster workflows, but you can get much faster websites out of it, and stores, and the load times can become faster. And now you have a way of working. Your developers will have a composable workflow. You're not spending all that time on operations. And it makes it much easier to start plugging in a new commerce element, a new CMS, a new search tool, and so on. Yeah. So that's actually our big focus areas, is the migration from legacy stacks and monoliths to composable, but also in very practical real world scenarios where you, for at least many years, will often have both, right? And it's not an either or, and it needs to work along the way, right? Yeah. And so I think the best thing you can do is of course understanding, and you can sit with solution architects like from a company like Netlify, and sort of go through the stack, figure out where will the first changes have the most impact? Where do we have the least dependencies? Where is it easiest to do a lift here? And then the beautiful part of it is you will get value for it. You'll understand the return on investment, and you can use that as a business case for why you want to move other parts of the business over as well. And that's so hard to do in the old world, right? Because you sort of had to be done before you saw any sort of return on investment, or before you would find out if you had chosen the right stack, right? And that has burnt the fingers of so many people in commerce departments, digital departments, marketing departments across the world, right? And I really, really think that this approach is so much healthier. Yeah. So my suggestion in that is to start there, figuring out where if we approach headless, composable, Mark, where can we slice something out? Where do we feel that there's the most immediate need? And then figure out a way of creating a project around that, where you can see some implementation, see some success of that, see some numbers on it that you can then use to justify to move further from that, right? And I will say one thing that you often hear is that someone will come and say, oh, we want to use composable or headless. Let's start with a new commerce system. And then they buy that. And then, sales takes the shortest path. So they'll be like, yep, you're composable now. You're good to go. And then they're like, why don't we have a faster time to market? Why is our web properties not faster? And so on. And that's because, yes, you got part of the backend sliced out and have modern workflows, and it works as an API, and it's multi-tenant software as a service, and it's beautiful. But operations is still the same. Yeah. Right. And you're still jumping through all the same hoops, and you still have the same dependencies that you did before on consultancies or internal IT organizations, right? To get anything live, right? And anything that's responsible for building out the web properties or the stores themselves, the UIs, they're still done in the same way. And so it is a little more holistic than that. You can't just choose a headless component and think you're done. You have to think about, I need the right component, but also need to implement it into the right architecture. So I need to update my operations. But that doesn't mean that you have to go out and fix everything at once. You can still do that in a way where you can slice out a corner, see success, and go from there.
Wonderful. Yeah, no, I like that advice, and I like the realism about it as well. But that's great to know that you don't have to start completely from scratch, and you can start
yes.
slow.
I spent 14 years in agencies before founding Netlify together with Matt. Yeah. And this was, I mean, that was the nature of the game, right? Like it's not a small hurdle, right? It was the primary hurdle that we stood for when it came to sort of the largest solutions for clients' marketing departments, right? And this is really a viable path forward. But Rome was not built in a day, and it'll take time to get there. So make sure that you're doing it in a way where you get success as you go along.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, again, I'd like to thank Chris Bach, co-founder, CCO, and CSO at Netlify, for joining the show. You can learn more about Chris and Netlify, as well as Mock Alliance, by following the links in the show notes. Thanks again for listening to the Agile Brand with Greg Kihlstrom podcast, brought to you by Tech Systems. If you enjoyed the show, please take a minute to subscribe on your podcast channel of choice and leave us a rating so that others can find the show more easily. You can access more episodes of the show at www.gregkihlstrom.com. That's GregKihlstrom.com. To get a copy of my latest book, House of the Customer, visit my website, or you can find it on Amazon or other retailers. The Agile Brand is produced by Missing Link, a Latina-owned, strategy-driven, creatively fueled production co-op. From ideation to creation, they craft human connections through intelligent, engaging, and informative content. Until next time, stay agile.